So I'm just going to show you some images because I'm, cartoonist. I just thought I'd start with a little background on the secrets of being a graphic novelist. This is the boys club version because I'm a boy. So it's important to have life experience. You have to believe in yourself, of course. Some spiritual connection is helpful. That's always good, yes, reading 1 million comics. I understand also reading other literature, but so I've been told. And of course, just being excited about a career in the arts. That's probably the most important one. Not having a plan B. So it's been a long time that we've been trying to narrate our history, and the remnants of cave people is there's not music left, but there is some art, and if not for that, we would have no idea what our shopping habits were back then. That's Banksy. He put that up at the British Museum, and it stayed up for 2 weeks before somebody was like, "Wait a minute." So it seemed appropriate that the first story in Kafkaesque is I used cave people, and it's one of the beauties of Kafka's work is that it just lends itself to so many different ideas and time periods, and it's not stuck with one point. So Kafka, he only lived to be 40, he died from tuberculosis. So the path that led me to this book, just a quick history here, Mad Magazine, very important, kind of an introduction between politics and humor for me. Growing up in the 70s, I would have loved to have done happier, prettier art. Unfortunately, the Vietnam War as a backdrop kind of influenced my process. And when I was in art school, that's Ronald Reagan there, if you don't recognize him, was another major influence because he was coming up on being president. And that inspired my friend Seth Tabachman and me to have the title World War III Illustrated for the fanzine we were publishing. We were doing political comics and things like that in the late 70s, and it was pretty much that whole area had died. The underground comic scene was dying just as we were arriving. It's kind of the tradition, like you get to the beach just in time for the medical waste to wash up. And we started doing these sort of world issues because we were worried about there being a nuclear war. And the Cold War was going on and everything going on with Russia. And so it was, very scary. But we found out very quickly that we could talk about what was going on in New York City in the late 70s and early 80s, and it would be direct experience, and it would allow us to talk about things, not just what we read in the newspaper, but what we experienced personally. And that's where I did some of my first Kafka. I got some of my first Kafka pieces published. And so I found that this piece Trees overlaid kind of perfectly for a story about homeless people. And it was one of those kind of somewhat magic moments for me, at least personally, was the way the text spoke to me and suggested these things. And I really felt like Kafka was whispering in my ear, or it was a combination of the environment and having the text as kind of an anchor that let me do wilder page designs and to explore what the meaning of the stories could be. And it really is, it's an interpretation. And that's one of the beauties of his writing, is that each person is going to bring their own story to it. So when I was working with these Kafka stories and part of my just general interest in comics, I went and looked back at what comics had been done at the time that he was writing these stories. And this is one example. Lionel Feininger, who did Wee Willie Winky's World. He only did like 12 of these, but they were just seismic in their incredible, not only impact, but also just visually exploring this brand new form. And Winsor McCay, of course, who under the pen name Silas, did this comic called Dream of the Rarebit Fiend. And he started doing this in 1905 or 1906. And they were very, what shall I say, Kafkaesque. And I always wondered if Kafka had maybe seen some of these. You know, did newspapers get across the ocean? Why not? And each one of his stories goes like this. It's inspired by the notion of you eat this rarebit cheese and it gives you indigestion that causes strange dreams. But the difference with Winsor McCay is that he always let his characters wake up at the end, and Kafka was not so kind. There was even a movie done at the time of the strip that was, I think it was in 1913, and that was, you know, playing with film. They jumped immediately to special effects at the time that they were doing. You know, when film came out, there was like documentary where you just set a camera up and shot the street, and then they got into special effects right away. Also Franz Masereel, who was, again, this is parallel to the time he did these wordless woodcut novels, and the German expressionist film, which, you know, these cross influences back and forth between the art and the film. This is a little later, a little post-Kafka, but Lynd Ward was more, I should say, an influence on me, but then also influenced by Franz Masereel. It's a big circle of these things. And you can really see the flavor of Kafka in this and of that time period, which this book came out right before the Depression. Kathy Kollwitz in Germany, and John Hartfield. And he was doing this before Hitler was rising. And, you know, when Hitler did rise up, then a lot of these artists had to flee. And Kafka's family pretty much all perished in concentration camps. So I made my way through a lot of Kafka short stories, and then thought I would try to take on Metamorphosis, his most famous story. You remember Metamorphosis, where Homer Simpson wakes up to find that he's been dope. Slight variation of the. Anyway, that was my first step into doing Metamorphosis before I got to the actual book. And just a little bit about process. So I try and get characters, and this would apply to anything I'm working on, any bigger project. Get reference. Back in the day when I used to go to the library at 41st Street and dig through the folders, which, you know, Google is A-okay with me, but there was something joyful about that discovery. That is just an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and I do these little tiny boxes. It helps me figure out what the pacing of the story is. Then there's a rough sketch done at a 1/3 size, then a tighter pencil at size of print. And in this particular case, and the same with the whole of Kafkaesque, I did it on something called scratchboard, which is a chalk-covered paper that I put the ink on in this case. It's really thin, and I can light box it. But then I go in with a scratch tool, and I can scratch it so it looks like woodcut. So it was an opportunity to sort of replicate the vibe of the work that was being done in Kafka's period. And right outside the window, there's you know, some of the influences, the things that make Kafkaesque an ongoing and current event. And one of the reasons why World War III Illustrated, which we started in 1979, is now coming up on its next issue, almost in its 40th year of publication. Insane. Our secret business model is nobody made any money, nothing to fight over. I'm not sure anybody'd follow that. Wall Street guys are going, So one of my muses, as it happens, is the A-bomb. I realized this more recently, that when I was a kid, I learned about the A-bomb, and it's been a very positive motivating factor, because I'm always like, got to get that book done before they drop the bomb, got to do this. It's a weird thing, and so, you know, and I think in our current times, you know, but it's sort of like ended up that sort of obsession has been has fueled a lot for me, And it has great application, as I do Spy versus Spy. This is a photo I took right after the election. You may remember how that went down. That's when we added another horseman to the apocalypse. There's 5, count them. So yeah, Kafkaesque seems like a very appropriate thing to be working on right now. I'm definitely have that sense of like urgency where I should be doing something that applies to our current events. So, you know, because we're in this weird nebulous fake news point. So, you know, that famous Magritte, this is not a pipe. And that this too is, it should be in French actually there. So I feel like we're right so knee deep in Kafkaesque times that he's kind of floating in my thoughts all the time. His work really transcends this the insanity and the way we're seeing how these bureaucracies are the evidence of their process and how convoluted and absurd they are. Do not stare at that too long because it causes blind rage. So I've found. I'm actually in Trumpaholics Anonymous, and I'm trying to work through this. So, but back to why I'm drawn to the way I can apply current events and Kafka. Take the story of the Burrow. It's about a mole that is building these walls and this shelter so that it can keep the other out. Before the Law, which is about a man trying to get in to get some justice and being told to wait. And he perpetually waits through the story and is constantly blocked from getting to the other side of that fence. Or the coal bucket rider, where a guy has so little coal to heat himself that his bucket is so light that he floats. Or very current, in the Penal Colony, where they've developed this machine that writes your crime on your back carefully, although it's kind of hard to read because you're lying down. And if you think that looks anything like, say, a young Donald Trump, you're just seeing things because it's just the way I draw. But like our current events, the machine is in the midst of exploding, and spoiler alert, this has a happy ending. Not for the officer, but for us. So in closing, I feel I need to talk about the birds and the bees in a less enjoyable way, especially with what's going on in North Carolina, what's going on in around the world, in the Philippines. So this is just a little weather report. Gets a little biblical here. If you've been to Mexico, grasshoppers are quite delicious, by the way. But not to end on a downer note, I just want to point out that in the event that it goes off the rails like this, alternate side parking will remain in effect. So yes, indeed, I do scream, and I do so through my work as often as possible. But the beauty of art is that it can also show you the way you would like things to be. I did a comic strip years ago where Trump builds a wall. I did this in 1990, builds a wall. The comic's called The Wall. It was published in Heavy Metal, and he builds a wall between the east side and the west side of Manhattan, and he becomes president in this story. So I got to do the story where he unbecomes president, goes to jail. If it worked that way so well, before, why can't it work again? So here we are, and we're coming up on a new opportunity for changing the direction things are going. Fingers crossed, breath held, so that we have a new song that we can be singing. And if there's ever been a time to start playing a new song, this is it. And I'm a cockeyed optimist, and I follow my Buddhist guide through it all. Thank you.
I want to ask you first about sort of a point you make in the introduction to the book, which is Kafka's comic side. I don't mean that in the comic book side, right? But I mean in the comic side. That you noticed or you read that when he read this to his friends, they all laughed. They thought that these were very funny, and that was part of what drew you to Kafka in the first place. Obviously, you worked for Mad Magazine for quite some time. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what part of Kafka's comedy appeals to you, and how that, if it does, manifests itself in the stories that you chose to pick.
Well, I mean, there's probably a gallows humor factor running deep in it, and I guess it's it's that Jewish humor factor which you're so familiar with, that you may have heard about it, and that I think that's one of the things that dark times can really produce some fantastic humor. Maybe it's in retrospect how funny it was, but I heard that he had, in fact, I think was getting complaints from neighbors because he had a job working for an accident insurance company, and he actually did a lot of good for workers. He had manuals and things, to help them not get torn up by machines, but he would write then at 2:30 in the morning, and he'd be up writing and laughing, and he literally got complaints from neighbors over this. It was like, keep it down,
Were there stories that you chose where you said, because one of the things we were talking about backstage is that your artistic adaptation is in some level necessarily, it has to be an interpretation. So were there somewhere you said, I got to bring out this laughter, I got to bring out the funny, particularly in ways that maybe the text is ambiguous or it's hard to sort of tell that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's my natural inclination, and I think that the way that comics is a perfect form to show the humorous side of Kafka, because there's that beautiful contradiction the possible contradiction between text and image,
right, okay.
Where it can show one thing and say another, and they can be almost the war between those two things, or the interaction can be what's funny. It's like it's like saying right. It was a beautiful day, and the picture shows it's raining,
right.
And that it offered up that possibility. Some of the stories are kind of like the one I showed about the homeless person dying on the street. There wasn't like a humor angle per se.
You were trying to see the funny side of that one.
Well, the policeman has this sort of. I get into the drawing of it in a way where I'm finding some kind of humorous joy in the caricature of it. But there kept on being points in the stories that I find appealing seem to walk that line for the most part, and they had an aspect of it, or there was a way in which I would visually describe it that just naturally had humor in it. Right. Even in the Penal Colony, which is a disturbing piece, the character is so absurd, and the bureaucracy is so absurd, right. that in itself makes it have humor.
This is a natural thing. We're just going to tattoo on his flesh, right?
Exactly.
Sure, yeah. That's what you do.
At one point in the story, he says, here's the guide to the machine is this piece of paper with these scribbles on it, and he hands it to the guy who's the visitor, who's listening to the officer, and he says, read this, and he's holding up just basically it looks like a fur ball, and the guy's like, I can't read it, and
right. And that comes out very pungently in the visual.
Yeah, and it's just like that showing that is a really it's one of the aspects of it where it works well to have visuals go with the text.
And I want to follow up on that visual appeal, because we were talking a little bit, and you were saying to me that some of the stories you used the word sparks. Right, that there were these ideas that sort of came full-fledged, and then there were others where it was more of a process. So I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about one of the stories that we might read in the book that came from a spark, and what that spark was, and how it sort of blossomed out of that.
There's a story, Give It Up, in there, and the magic of doing these things, I straight arm it to some extent, but at the same time, I've grown up hearing about, the Beatles sitting down and writing a song in like 3 seconds and then just like the monster hit or whatever, and that sometimes that can happen in art, and it's my greatest joy is when something just seems to coalesce like that. And I had that with lots of the stories where just the existence of the text gave me this freedom that I could move around and even do storytelling that was much more not strictly sequential in an obvious way, not 9-panel page, but like a figure here and something jumping over there, and that the writing really, it functioned as an anchor for me, but it really inspired that to such an extent. I did have those periodic moments where I felt like Kafka was whispering in my ear, and I was just like, okay, wow, that was easier than it should be. And with my own writing, it's certainly not necessarily that obvious or doesn't present itself that way.
And did that, you were talking about going to the library in previous eras and looking for a reference. Did that search for reference slow you down? How did that work with this sort of smooth sailing and then saying, oh, I got to get the coal bucket right, or the lampshade, or whatever it is?
Right. Well, I mean, nowadays with Google, it's just like, I just type in, 1906 coal bucket and get like 12 choices. So it's really pretty great. And where I went, I had periods where I've just felt like I just want to be free from the shackles of reference, and I want to just draw. And now I'm getting more into a place where I really enjoy the reference a lot. It's like that if I try to look at something, even if I'm just doing a frying pan or something that you could have a nice symbol for, when you look at the real object, there's so much character in those, and that ends up being what fleshes out the story and gives it its period sense. Mm-hmm. And so with Kafka, it certainly, looking at reference from that time period also got me kind of in the mood. And sometimes what music I might play at the time that will, whether it's classical or something that will feel more appropriate to the time period. All those elements. It's like I went to Mexico for 4 months because the next project I'm working on is Heart of Darkness, and I really wanted to get smells and sound in the work and temperature. And it's really, the more you can, bring that in. So sometimes, creating an atmosphere around which to do it. A lot of times, you can't do that because you need the solitary. Right. But when that's possible, it's really important.
But I think very briefly on one foot, we want to hear your Kafka Spotify playlist. Like, what was the what was it that was that particularly?
It was actually just continuous scream followed by a laugh track. It was great.
That seems right. Yeah. Ultimately, though, you have the sparks, you have the reference, but you're starting with the words. I mean, you're with the words on the page. And how is Kafka as a scripter of comic material? How is he as a comic book writer?
It depends on the story. Some of them, he's brilliant because he's really short. Uh-huh. And also one thing he's super convenient is he's dead. So there's a lot of the back and forth thing.
The
that
perfect
happens.
writer.
Like, hey, I didn't like what you did with blah blah blah. It's like none of that. So that's always a positive. But it's something like The Burrow was a much longer story, and it's very labyrinthian, which the story is also. But also, there's a lot of repetition, and so I found myself like saying like what. There's a lot of these ideas that are being repeated, and that there's a freedom in that. Like I think, well, here's what I took from it, and here's what I found to be the most germane aspect of it, and so that then I can see what I can remove and what I can't. But with a lot of those stories, they hew so closely to the text because it was 2 paragraphs,
right,
and that's convenient. That's when he went short story, he went really short story.
That's absolutely right. You mentioned obviously in the course of your presentation, the role of the political, and I just want to push a little bit or ask you a little bit more about that sort of for Kafka. A lot of people over the last decades have used Kafka as a political writer to comment on this and that. And you talked about that with the homelessness, but are there other elements of that you felt that you want to put explicitly into the stories when you were working on this now? Besides the young officer, were there stories that really spoke to you of the moment that changed your visual interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, completely. Well, before the law, that I showed a couple of pages from that, I suddenly thought, like all his characters are white, and why do I have to do that? And I don't. And the story suddenly rang as having a completely different possible aspect to it. And of course, perfect for Kafka is regret, right? So as soon as the book's published, I'm filled with regret over what other things I could have done. And one of them was I was looking at there's a story of the Hunger Artist, and I thought the character should have been a woman. It would have been a perfect line to walk of talking about several different things at the same time. And when I did it originally, I was thinking about Michael Jackson, actually, because it's like the character who sets himself on fire for us, or and in fact in the story that you'll note a little white glove that the Hunger Artist has. But that's what I was thinking of at the time, and that these were done over years. I did my first Kafka short story in 1988, so this has been sort of a long running love affair, as it were.
Well, we're very glad that you shared this love affair with all of us. I think that I just want to make sure that we have time to open it up for some questions before we. So let's just see if there's anybody from the crowd who wants to ask something or say something.
Peter, you said you were adapting Heart of Darkness next, but you went to Mexico for that. Are you going to be setting it in Mexico as opposed to
No. It's just the atmosphere. I couldn't get to the Congo right away, so it just.
So it's going to be a one-to-one. It's not going to be like a Kafka where you.
I'm not updating it that way. I mean, I'm working with the text in a way that makes it not unbearable for current times, but it's but not updated in that respect at all. It's about colonialism, but there's so many parallels. I mean, it's the joy of history is that we get to see these things repeated again and again, and aspects of that in that story that what gives me the oomph to work on it, because I do feel so, as I was saying before, I feel so urgent about current events, and not just Trump. This has been going on for a while, and it certainly changed. It's been upped a lot, but environmental issues and just our long history of abuse, and the way Africa was carved up, and colonialism, and the ripple effect of all that right up to the moment that when these things feel like I'm talking about something that's going on now, even though it doesn't, it can be eternal that way, unfortunately.
Two questions. One is, do you know if did you ever think about the relationship between Kafka and Alfred Kuban, the Czech illustrator, or did Alfred Kuban mean anything to you? I don't know if you know his work.
I do, but I didn't make. I wasn't thinking about that. I was more. I mean, Masereel, who's Belgian, was kind of more in, more in the DNA of my work in Lynd Ward. And a lot of German expressionism in general,
sure.
But not specifically his work.
Okay.
Though I like it.
The second question was, Kafka was, he's very graphic and very realistic and super detailed in some ways, but he also there's an abstractness to a lot of his work, and he famously said about the bug in Metamorphosis, when the first edition they wanted to do a cover illustration, he said the bug cannot be shown.
Right.
So I don't know if you've wrestled with this aspect of Kafka.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, what he also said was he told his executor, Max Brod, to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts, which is pretty much everything that I published in this book. Mm-hmm. So I figured I had a little leeway with his, but that's, that was one of those questions, and even, it's been argued whether, is Gregor Samsa of the Metamorphosis, is it, what exactly is he? It's vermin, or is it a cockroach, or, there's the different translations. And an aside, one of the really interesting things of working with this was reading a lot of different translations of Kafka and seeing how dramatically it changes Kafka's voice depending on the stilted tone. Like, I grew up on the 1950s, Muir and stern translations that are really they're really clunky, and I always thought that's how Kafka wrote. And then I discovered in the process of working on new translations with a German person how many, there's a lot of different word choices there, and there's been modernized versions of Kafka which I can't get with, because they sound it sounds a little creepy to have this somewhat modern voice, because I have a fixed voice of Kafka in my mind, which may be inaccurate. It might be, and that it just was, it brought, it made me much more aware of the impact of translations, how they, how dramatically they can affect how you perceive a writer, and where, you're at the mercy of a lot of different choices, and that a person makes. I like the stodgy old choices for the most part, but anyway, I went for, actually, my original design for the Metamorphosis cover was it was going to have a translucent covering with the title on it, and a self cover with the image of the bug, and you would just see it like looking through frosted glass, and you'd have to remove that cover in order to do it, to see it, and then I'd be like, hey, I didn't put it on the cover, you lifted it. And curiously, the publisher didn't jump at that opportunity to spend another, nickel per book or whatever it was going to cost. But I thought, like, oh, that would have been great. So, and then I would have answered your question by slinking out of it through fancy print.
I just want to follow up on that. You said growing up with the Muir translations. When did you first come to Kafka? When was I know when you did it with the Simpsons thing.
Yeah, it was fairly late, actually. I mean, I'm sure I came upon something in high school, but it was in college that I read Metamorphosis, and that was the first thing I read. And then I had a friend of mine who was a huge Kafka fan, and then we would have beers, and he would read a story aloud, and hearing it aloud is really put it in a different place. Whereas I thought Metamorphosis, I found it like dark and disturbing and like, woo, that was creepy. When I heard these stories read, that was almost like the comic version of it, because it was like a stand-up comedy routine then. And then the emphasis and all that was on many of the stories I ended up doing was this, just sort of the absurdity and the beauty of, the turns of phrases and the perspective on the world.
So your formative experience of Kafka was a lot like his first audience's experience. It was really
exactly, because he did a lot. They did readings and things like that. But another great example of somebody who was just simply not famous, could have been completely lost to us, and it was just fortunately there was somebody out there who virtually all the titles of his stories were come up with by his executor. Those are not his titles for the most part, and there's missing pieces of stories and
had there been, I mean, this doesn't seem like the kind of thing that the classic comics people would have done, the Comic Classics Illustrated would have done, but had there been sort of previous, when in the 60s, the 70s or 80s,
I never saw that. The closest that came, and it was fortunately it was a hair's breadth. There's Kafka for Beginners.
Oh, right. Okay.
By David Zane Marowitz did the translations, and Robert Crumb illustrated them, and they're sort of short takes. It's like Metamorphosis is 13 pages. When I did the book, it's 80 pages. Right. And he did a version of the Burrow and all that, and that came out right. I had already done a bundle of the stories, so that if I had not started in on this and Crumb had done that, I would have gone like, go, because now if I do it, then it's going to look like I saw Crumb, and now I'm following in those footsteps. And so, fortunately, I was not stymied by that, but
we're all very glad you got in first.
Yeah, I got in under. Well, that came out, I think, in 95 or 6, his collection, and I started in 88.
Yeah,
so
obviously got a while. Yeah,
I was like, I'll show you, man.
Other questions or comment? Well, yes, please.
So I know your more recent work for the New Yorker. But I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit more about your relationship to somebody else's text and turning that into a visual narrative. We've had conversations about your hatred of music videos, because you really don't like that it defines this visual for something that someone might have a very personal relationship to.
Right.
And then it's out there. But then you just talked about how the text, having an existing text you're working with, can be extremely freeing in a certain way, because there are already conventions that exist, and you can break those conventions.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas creating a visual that has never existed before, just coming from you, there are no rules to break. So if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between...
No, that is one of the maybe difficult aspects of doing a translation or interpretation of it. I, of course, hope, for example, that people will read the Kafka text and not, it's like, oh yeah, I read the comic, strictly. I mean, I certainly want them to do that as well. I know from the experience of Metamorphosis, getting into textbook, the aspects of my adaptation, that it was, in fact, it walked people into something that they weren't necessarily going to pick up, and that I know through that, on occasion, people do actually go back to the text. But that's, that is the danger. It's, as you said with music video, is that I have, so many songs that are related to an experience. It's a personal thing in a moment, falling in love, my first experience with heroin, things like that. And that it can overlay in such a way that it's, when you hear the song, you're seeing the image of that somebody put in there themselves. Right. And so it's that's a conundrum. And thanks for the tough question, daughter.
Someone with a 90s hairdo right from the video.
Yeah, exactly. I think Pat Benatar almost on everything. Yeah. So that's a question. But I keep putting forward the idea of that this is just my take on it, and clearly with the way I've interpreted some of these Kafka stories, that wasn't his intention. I'm taking his intention and I'm running with it, and that is, I'm even more so trying to say, like, look, I'm going to take this and turn it into about cave people or about civil rights, and that is not in the text, and but that's I hope when somebody sees that, they will see what the possibility of the text can be, in addition to, like, God, boy, I read that and I didn't see that, and that's right, and then you might read it again and see something else. So,
well, I think you're absolutely right to say that Kafka is someone who puts out this material that sort of almost demands, interpret me, sort of says, I'm not telling you what this is about, please, and I think that what you've done in this book, conveniently available on sale for signing right after this, is give us a remarkable, brilliant, and passionate interpretation. One of many, but one that will last. So please join me in thanking Peter for a wonderful event.